Hi everyone, so today we're covering dural venous sinuses. Now, dural venous sinuses, these are basically venous channels that are located between two layers of the dura mater. Now, we are aware that dura mater has two layers. One is the periosteal layer, which is closer to the periosteum or to the bone, and then we have the meningeal layer, which is closer to the other layers of the meninges. Now, the function is that this drains blood from the brain, not just blood, but it also drains the CSF, right, which is the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, majorly it drains the blood from the cerebral veins, but also the diploic as well as the emissary veins. These are the three ways it, or three regions from which it takes the blood, or three vessels from which it takes the blood, and then it ultimately drains it into the internal jugular vein. So that's a very important point. So these are endothelium lined spaces which are formed where the periosteal and meningeal layers of the dura separate. So mostly you'll find these dural layers to be closely intact, but there's some points in the brain cavity where these are going to separate, right? And those are the positions or points where you're going to find the dural venous sinuses, hence the name dural venous sinuses, because it's located between the two dura mater layers. And the function is that it drains deoxygenated blood, cerebrospinal fluid, where the arachnoid granulations, and it ultimately drains into the internal jugular vein. It has no walls, it's not, and other than that, no walls, and it's not even muscular. And the blood flow, it depends on the gravity and pressure differences. Now, when you look at the diagram, so these are the you can see venous sinuses, you can see superior sagittal, inferior sagittal, straight, then you can see conference, then you can see transverse, sigmoid, and all of that. You may not be understanding, but this is a rough image of how they're located, right? So these are basically between the dura layers. So you can see these are the two layers of the dura, periosteal and the meningeal layer, right? Between them, you'll find dural venous sinuses. Now, I told you that these are the venous sinuses which are located between the two layers. Easy. Now these receive blood from the cerebral vein, right here you can see cerebral vein. Then you also receive the blood from emissary veins of the scalp, and then from the diploic veins, which are present in the periosteum. So these are the three regions from which it receives the blood. Now, not just blood, but it also receives the cerebrospinal fluid. And how so? That I'll tell you. DVS, the dural venous sinuses, these are similar to veins because they contain venous blood and they're lined with the endothelia, but then also not similar to veins because they lack walls and they lack a tunica media. Why they lack a tunica media? Because they're surrounded by the dural layers, right? Now, other than that, I told you that okay, so this is a complete image. You can see superior, inferior, and all of them labeled, right? I hope you can see superior, inferior, straight, and then the lateral ones are transverse. This is sigmoid. Then you have the internal. You have petrosal, superior, inferior, and then you have the cavernous sinus located on the either sides of the sella turcica, right? You can even locate the pituitary in the front. That's the pituitary, and then you have mammillary bodies, right? This is the cavernous sinus. Cavernous sinus is also one of the dural venous sinuses, and it's located on the either side of the dural, uh, on the either side of the sella turcica, right? So this is pituitary in the sella turcica, and this is the cavernous sinus on the either sides. It's very important because it also drains blood from the face and other regions. And there's a mnemonic that you need to remember, which is O tomcat. O tomcat. So O is for oculomotor, T is for the trochlear. Then O is for the ophthalmic division of your trigeminal nerve, which is the fifth cranial nerve. And then you have the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve. So O and then Tom. T, trochlear, O and M, ophthalmic and maxillary. And O is oculomotor. O, Tom, and then CAT is for the carotid artery. And then you have your, again, A is abducens and T is just there to complete the mnemonic. So you also have abducens. So you have third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. So third, fourth, fifth, and six cranial nerves, internal carotid artery, and pituitary. So this is the cavernous sinus for you guys, right? And all of the remaining you can see which are on the lateral walls, and right through or right to the middle courses the internal carotid artery and the abducens. Easy. So this is the cavernous sinus that you should be aware of as well. Now, when you talk about the circulatory system of the brain, so this is a rough overview before we jump to the venous sinuses. So you get your blood supply from internal carotid artery, vertebro-basilar artery. Remember the circle of Willis, so internal carotid artery and the vertebral basilar system. So that was the major, blood supply to the brain. Then they turn into cerebral arteries, then arterioles, and then a very defined capillary system which forms a blood-brain barrier, and it's very intricate. Then venules, eventually cerebral veins. So cerebral veins then drain into the dural venous sinus, but not just cerebral veins, but also the what do you have? Diploic veins and the emissary veins. And then eventually the dural venous sinuses drain into internal jugular vein, and that's how all of the blood supply goes back to the superior vena cava, right? This is very important. So the space you can see the dura mater, then you can also see the arachnoid matter, the one that's labeled here, highlighted, right? And below that you can see this is the innermost pia mater. The arachnoid matter, arachnoid, so it stands from spider. It's Latin. The Latin for it is spider, right? So you can see the spider like uh, markings here as well, right? Now, below the arachnoid matter, the space is the subarachnoid space, and that's the space where CSF flows. And the subarachnoid layer is going to form the arachnoid granulations, like this you can see. Now, these arachnoid granulations, these help to drain the CSF. So, CSF is going to drain from the subarachnoid space into the superior sagittal sinus, into the dural sinuses, particularly the superior sagittal sinus. So, here you can see CSF draining from the arachnoid granulation into the superior sagittal sinus, right? So this is also very important for you to know. Now, when you talk about dural venous sinuses, so here you can see superior sagittal sinus. It begins from the foramen cecum and it ends at the back into the internal occipital protuberance. And here also you can see its complete alignment in the skull. Just try to visualize how it is located, superior, inferior, and then transverse, sigmoid, internal, right? Here it's labeled. So superior sagittal from foramen cecum into and the internal occipital protuberance. Inferior sagittal sinus, very important point about it is that here it's formed inferior sagittal sinus. Okay, actually straight sinus. So straight sinus, very important point is that this is formed by the conjunction of your inferior sagittal sinus and the great cerebral vein, the vein of Galen. So vein of Galen, the great cerebral vein and inferior sagittal sinus, they come together to form straight sinus. Inferior sagittal sinus drains into straight sinus, right? So inferior sagittal sinus and great cerebral vein, they come together to form straight sinus. I hope that's clear. Superior sagittal and you can locate inferior sagittal. Inferior sagittal and great cerebral, they come together to form the straight sinus right here. Right, so straight sinus, and then you can see the confluence of sinus, and you can also see the occipital sinus. Occipital sinus goes from the confluence of sinus to the foramen magnum that you can clearly see. Then you have right and left transverse sinus. To visualize the transverse sinus, we have to come at the back. From the posterior aspect, you'll be able to see clearly that the transverse sinuses, they run laterally. So you can see this very clearly right here. And this is the occipital sinus. This is the smallest sinus. It comes from confluence and it goes to the foramen magnum. So transverse sinus, visualize it like this. Then here you can see the fox cerebri and you can see tentorium cerebri, and you need to be able to locate how at the superior border of fox cerebri you're going to find superior sagittal sinus, inferior border of fox cerebri you're going to find the inferior sagittal sinus, and the fox cerebri, it begins at the crista galli. Its origin is the crista galli and it inserts behind at the internal occipital protuberance. The superior sagittal sinus, it begins at the superior sagittal sinus begins at the foramen cecum and the internal occipital protuberance. You can see tentorium cerebri here also, and just locate how the dural sinuses are located. This I've already told you. This also, this is again the same thing but labeled superior, inferior, straight, transverse. Then transverse ultimately turns into sigmoid, then internal, petrosal, and cavernous. Veinous sinus is very important, right? I already made that clear. Now this is also done, this is also done, this is also done. This is very important. So in the midline, you can see superior sagittal sinus, and then you can see the inferior sagittal sinus, and you can see the straight sinus. Easy straight sinus is made by the inferior and the great cerebral vein. This is the midline structure. The two more midline structures that are not very important, but it's good if you know that. One is the interior and posterior intercavernous sinus. The fourth one, it joins both the lateral sinuses, and then you have the basilar sinus or basilar plexus. So basilar plexus, it basically drains the surrounding veins, right? So these are the midline structures. This is a clear picture because it includes all the important things and it's cleared up version. Here it's a little more complicated. Now, then the lateral aspect, you can see the transverse sinus. The first is the transverse sinus, then it forms the two is the sigmoid sinus, and then it drains into internal jugular vein. Here you can see petrosal veins. So petrosal veins, their function is that they drain the cavernous sinus. The superior petrosal vein drains the cavernous sinus and it drains into the sigmoid sinus. Whereas the inferior petrosal sinus, the good part about it is that it directly drains into the internal jugular vein. So that's something you need to know. So lateral aspect, you can see the transverse, sigmoid, superior, inferior, petrosal, right? And interiorly, you can see the cavernous sinus. And now, other than that, Uh, in the anterior aspect, you can also see the sphenoparietal sinuses. So sphenoparietal sinuses and cavernous sinus. Posteriorly, you can see the confluence of sinus and occipital sinuses. So easy. I hope that's clear as well. Now here you can see all of that I told you, all the information. Superior sagittal sinus, I've already told you, foramen cecum to the confluence of sinus. Inferior medial cerebrum to the confluence of sinus. Then straight sinus, inferior sagittal sinus to the confluence of sinus. Remember, straight sinus is formed by inferior sagittal sinus and the great cerebral vein. Then anterior and posterior intercavernous sinus, it connects the right and left cavernous sinuses. Then basal plexus, it connects the regional venous structures, right? Regional venous structures. Transverse sinus, it runs laterally. So confluence of sinus to the sigmoid sinus. And sigmoid sinus drains into the internal jugular vein. Then superior petrosal cavernous to sigmoid and inferior cavernous directly into the internal jugular. Right? Occipital, you can see it's here from confluence to the foramen of magnum. Then confluence of sinus is formed by all the important, you can see they've mentioned superior sagittal and occipital sinus, but the transverse also straight, also all of them. Interiorly, you can see cavernous sinus and sphenoparietal sinuses. Here also you can visualize superior, inferior. I hope you can locate the transverse as well. Right, and here you can see this is the straight sinus. It's formed by the sorry, so straight sinus is this one, right here. It's formed by the superior, you can see superior, and you can see the great cerebral vein coming from here. This is the great cerebral. So great cerebral and superior and inferior sagittal, they come together to form this one right here. This is what? This is the straight, and that is superior. Confluence also you can locate. Transverse also, occipital also you can locate. Transverse turns into sigmoid and it drains into internal jugular. And cavernous, you can see how one is draining into sigmoid, so that's superior petrosal, and one is draining directly into inferior, into the internal jugular, so that's inferior petrosal, right? This also you can see superior, inferior petrosal, superior into sigmoid sinus, and inferior into the directly into the internal jugular vein. Here you can see the great cerebral vein. It comes together with the inferior sagittal sinus to form the straight sinus. I keep repeating it because I don't want you to forget it. So that's pretty much it.